Oh, the streets of Stoke Newington, they've got tales to tell of boundary markers and chapels that fell.
Hi everyone, I'm joined today by Sam Cullen. He's the author of the book London's Lost Pubs. And as soon as he got in touch with me and told me that he's writing this book, I got very excited because lost pubs is one of the topics that I've been researching in Stoke Newington. And pubs in general is a topic that I'm fascinated by. So I was very quick to kind of ask them, can we have a chat and record it? And talk about some of the kind of the pubs that he researched in the Stoke Newington area, but I think also a lot of the observations and kind of findings that apply to pub closures in general. Some of you might be familiar with my Stoke Newington Lost Pubs walk that I wrote. It covers 22 locations in Stoke Newington. So, Sam, thanks a lot for making the time. I appreciate it. Maybe just to kick off, just kind of if you tell us a bit about kind of the book, what kind of got you interested in the topic, and then deciding to actually produce an entire book on the subject.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you for inviting me on. I've always, much like it sounds like yourself, and I'm sure all your, your viewers are. I've always been fascinated by pubs. I've lived in London for nigh on 20 years now. I think what made me interested is just that natural curiosity. I like all the pubs that I know and that I go to, but your mind sort of casts to, well, what about the ones slightly before my time, or the ones that were around when I was in London, but I didn't get to. I wrote a book a couple of years ago with a friend about pub names in London, and when researching that, I was finding loads that had really interesting names that I couldn't put in my old book because they were shut. And
Yeah.
I sort of had this list, and I thought, well, should I go off and do something with that? And I saw there weren't any books out there solely about lost pubs in London, and it's rare to find something that someone else hasn't written about in some shape or form. So I thought, well, I'd find it interesting. Hopefully, other people might find it interesting. So I thought I'd do it myself, really, and just went from there in terms of trawling the archives. And I now have a huge collection of old pub review back books dating back to the 1950s and 60s. But I looked at ones in local libraries from the 20s and 30s to sort
Wow.
of pull what were in those reviews and see what the most interesting ones were across the entirety of Greater London, and the stories they could tell us about what the places they used to have in their local communities.
And the book covers, I think, is it 200 pubs?
Just two
Wow.
204. It was 205.
Wow.
Just in the editing process, I took one out because it very happily reopened, and I did actually have one or two that reopened during the course of writing the book. So it isn't always a
Wow.
one-way street, which I'm very glad to have to make additions
Mhm.
and alterations in that regard.
So I'm curious, so how many pubs did you end up researching? And then what was the criteria to narrow it down to only
Well,
204?
Well, I sort of jokingly say in my introduction that I wanted to keep it relatively tight because I wanted it to be a coffee table book rather than the book the size of a coffee table. You could I tried to aim to ones that had shut within the last 20 to 25 years, so
Mhm.
people of working age would be aware of them, and I thought it felt like a nice cut off the turn of the millennium. I also looked to make sure I had enough to say about them. I wanted there to be something that I could refer to. Like if there wasn't, and there may be some that, certainly could sort of do a second volume if anyone likes the first one enough. But there had to be stuff, a hook to
Mm.
write about. And that's how certain ones got drawn to my attention. Sometimes even after they'd shut, in the case of I think we'll go to it in a bit, but the Happy Man, for example, in its tree. But it had to have something that I felt that
Yeah.
I could write about that wasn't solely it opened and then it closed. There
Yeah,
had
there
to
was a
be some,
pub and
some
then
little,
it closed and
yeah,
that's it. Yeah.
exactly. There had
Yeah.
a bit of a hook, a little bit of interest to draw me in and hopefully draw other people in.
Yeah, and of course, like I said, Stoke Newington, which I don't think it's unique to this area, but this just happens to be the area that I focus on. So
Mm.
we lost 22 pubs, which is a lot. And when I
Yeah,
show people kind of old photos or when they kind of see on the map where there used to be pubs, I think half of them were converted to residential properties.
yeah.
So you can still tell, oh, this is a pub building, and the name is sometimes you can still kind of see it in some of the signage. In other cases, the whole site was redeveloped. So we're kind of lucky because you actually cover in the book two pubs that technically are in Stoke Newington. And I think we're going to talk a bit about those. They're not maybe kind of the pubs that people automatically think about when it comes to Stoke Newington. And I think that's because they're kind of more on the outskirts of what used to be the Stoke Newington kind of borough. That
Yeah.
was abolished in 1965. But as far as I'm concerned, kind of focusing on the old local authority, they were definitely Stoke Newington pubs.
Yeah.
So love to hear kind of what did you kind of uncover about the Happy Man, and obviously there's another one that we're going to talk about.
Well, I think the interesting thing about the happy man, and this is one of the themes that came out in my book, is that I didn't solely want to do old historic pubs. I wanted to articulate and give a voice to ones that were post-war, and obviously it was a
Yeah,
post-war part of the is it the Woodbury? It was the edge of the estate, wasn't it?
it was built as part of the Woodberry Down Estate, so there
Woodbury
was
Down
a load of
Estate. Yeah,
shops just kind of running in the
yeah,
middle, and I think the pub, I think for my was kind of 1960 or
yeah.
thereabout. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I was really keen to try and get them in, and obviously it has a relatively short life when you consider some of the pubs that opened and shut after over 100 years. But those were ones that really captured me. I wanted to make sure I wasn't just doing the old ones, as important as they are. And I think what's interesting about the Happy Man, obviously, it had a relatively short life. It's interesting often when pubs change their names, and I know at one point it was called the Blarney Stone, amongst other things.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
still got a little bit, and this is what's interesting because it only shut about 2020, didn't it? That I also think that it's got a bit of a digital footprint still. So I found some of the posts in the late
They've got like a
2010s.
Facebook page. I
Yeah, it's
as well. You
Facebook
can
page
see
about
some parties and yeah,
come here for the karaoke, come here to the
yeah.
cup final, and it'd be interesting to see how that sort of digital footprint is preserved. But I think what really grabbed me about it and how I first found out about it was, I think, just after COVID when I was doing a walk with a friend of mine who lives closer to Homerton, and he was telling me about the huge saga about the Happy Man tree that the pub
Mm,
had been demolished. I think a year or so prior, but there was that massive saga about saving the Happy Man tree, which I know eventually was
mhm.
shut down, and has even turned into a film. So that really, and I think it was on a film festival in a year or so ago. But I think that captured me because obviously the pub was relatively small in its own right, but the saga of the
Yeah.
tree extended beyond the pub's life. But also, it's a good epitome of those sort of post-war estate pubs, which people sort of are easy to forget. And I put similar other ones, in northwest London. I had one similar
Mm.
in southeast London in Loughborough Junction, the fantastically named Hero of Switzerland. So I like that because it gave me one that wasn't just a ye oldie pub that had been there since the Victorian times and
Yeah.
shut a
Yeah.
couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing from a Stoke Newton perspective, because I always tell people, and it's my walk as well, that the whole northern side of kind of Stoke Newington, north of Church Street, there were hardly any pubs. It was a very
Yeah,
kind of leafy, almost suburban area. One of my theories is because it was primarily owned by the Church of England, the whole land that got sort of redeveloped, then either it was stipulated that pubs should not be included in any kind of redevelopment, or purely because the kind of the, I would say, the class of residents that they were trying to attract meant that, it was all just kind of big houses. So the Happy Man is really just one of a handful of pubs that are in kind of the northern kind of half of Stoke Newington. The other one was the Manor House that was also sadly sort of closed as well. So there weren't that many. So I think for the people living and even working in that area, I'm guessing there weren't that many options. And I think
mm,
on the Happy Man as well, I heard from people that grew up in the estate, they said that it was very much a teacher's pub because you had the secondary school and you had the primary
yeah,
school that were built as part of the estate. And I think that was the natural place for them to maybe kind of go for a drink after a hard day's kind of teaching. What are some of the, I guess, in kind of the last 25 years? I mean, there's a whole reasons for pub closures. It's also in
yeah,
the news. We were just saying before we started the recording that Swiss Cottage, obviously, it's is now just losing its iconic pub,
mm,
unfortunately. So it's something that is still happening. People hear about the statistics about number of pubs closing, a day in the country and so on. What did you find, and anything that surprised you about kind of more contemporary
mm.
pub closures?
I think it's an interesting one, and I think it does fall into three or four sort of groups. So you've obviously got, as you say, some that are wiped out due to redevelopment of the area or the estate they were in. I think a lot, and you have some of these probably, I'm sure a lot of these in the Stoke Newton wider area. are because in the last 20 to 25 years, housing has become more and more expensive. And, I mean, a building has more value as a private property than it does as a sort of community one. And I think that's a fascinating flip around than in the 1980s when obviously London had a declining population.
Hmm.
So there were fewer people to go to the pubs, but there were fewer people to want the pubs for other things. And then you also have, I think you have the ones where the pub is still viable, but people are trying to do other things with it, whether or not they're trying to convert the top floor into a flat or something, and then that
Hmm.
that comes with its own challenges. And then finally, you sadly have the ones where pubs are at threat, and it's across the boundary, I know, but there's a Seckford Arms, as you might know, in Islington, where
Mm.
neighbours are complaining because it's too noisy, and then you have sort of people kicking up a fuss, and then there is the broader trend that they've really truly articulated of just people going to the pub less, and it being easier to go to supermarkets and buy alcohol in a way that it wouldn't have been, I don't know, 30, 35 years ago when you would have
Hmm.
had off license, yeah, but that has certainly become a factor, even though it's quite hard to ascertain that because you're never really going to see the books of a pub, are you? You don't know exactly what's
Yeah.
going on behind the scenes.
The second pub that's technically in Stoke Newington is kind of the one that was facing Finsbury Park. It was on Seven Sisters Road, and that was the Hornsey Wood Tavern.
Yeah.
So I think that's one that a lot of people probably weren't familiar with. I have to admit as well, I only learned about it after it was demolished when I was doing my own research and trying to pinpoint all the pubs that were in the old borough of Stoke Newington. So what can you tell us about that one?
Well, I think this is a fascinating one, and it's a lovely contrast from one to the other because this one, even though the building that was demolished in the mid noughties only dated really from about, the late Victorian era, the
Hmm.
records suggest there was a pub with that name dating back to the mid 18th century, really. And,
Mm.
it was a tavern, as the name suggests, in Hornsey Wood when there was a wood there. And it was, start the 19th century. It became a tavern as part of a a leisure park that had a fishing and boating lake. So it was almost like,
Because I think was the original one actually in present day Finsbury Park. I think when I looked at the map,
yeah, when it
it
was
looks
sort of
like
a
it was
wood.
originally what became Finsbury Park, and then the Victorian was built
Yeah,
on the road on a main thoroughfare, which was usually the case because there was a lot of kind of footfall, a lot of traffic. But I think its origin, like you're saying, was definitely much older.
yeah, yeah, and it's a bit like you have one or two of the other ones like that. I think there was White Conduit House in Islington where you're having to put your head back and imagine these as like huge private like parks and pleasure gardens, and the tavern is one part of. There's probably
Yeah.
not in each one, but there'd be a spa and a boating lake, and obviously that was its first incarnation. But then it had a long stint, as you say, on the Seven Sisters Road for over 130 years, and then in the 60s it came into its own as many pubs did, with gigs and
Yeah.
to all intent and purposes, Led Zeppelin played there in their
Yeah.
early days, Jethro Tull, Jeff Beck, so there was all that going on. But towards the end of its life, it became, as I think you might have alluded to, the Alexandra bar, and its digital footprint has people praising its Thai food,
Mm.
and they reference live music. But by that point, obviously, I think Led Zeppelin and their successors would be charging you a bit more to see them somewhere in a bigger venue, using surge pricing. Yeah, it was demolished closed in 2007 and demolished soon after. But it's fascinating, as you say, one of them like that really harks back to when the area was all leafy, and
Yeah.
the name really does link back to when it was in Hornsey Wood.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for taking the time. It was fascinating. If you ever visit Stoke Newington and you want to visit some of the ones that are still open, I can definitely recommend at least 10.
That sounds like a good
Yeah, we,
start. A
we
good
are, like I said,
lunchtime.
we lost 22, but we're also still blessed with quite a few.
Yeah,
And each I find is kind of special and unique in its own way. So you're always welcome.
brilliant. Thank you very much. I look forward to adding it to my list.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheers.